Voter frustration with politics and government stems in large part from a lack of transparency in the political process. Fortunately for us, we have two guests who've spent a year working on a special report uncovering how the process really works. John Myers, KQED's senior editor for California Politics and Government, and Marisa Lagos, who reports for KQED's California Politics and Government desk. Political influence in California politics: the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world, and by Kaiser Permanente. Thrive. From the California Channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Over the last year, KQED, Public Media for Northern California, has engaged in an in-depth analysis of the role of political influence in California government. Our guests are the investigative reporters who led that project. John Myers, KQED's senior editor for California Politics and Government, and Marisa Lagos, who reports on California politics and government for KQED. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks.
So, Marisa, let me start with you. A lot of people think that all special interest money goes to one party or another. For example, a lot of people assume that all the corporate money goes to the Republicans and all the union money goes to the Democrats. You found, however, that special interests really aren't that special. Instead, political influence, the game seems to be played by hedging your bets. Can you explain what you find?
Yeah, I mean, when we looked at the sort of overall giving, I mean, it's very easy to say, well, unions give to Democrats or, business groups give to Republicans. But really, a lot of the big groups in the state tend to give money to sort of everybody. And I think that the idea is that you just want to make sure that whoever's in the Capitol, you have their ear. And, I don't think that the public understands that it's not always this tit for tat, I give you money and you give me what I want. It's really just a way to buy influence and access. And I think access is the most important thing there, because if you can't bend the ear of somebody who's in power, right, your opinion doesn't matter.
So the money really is to make your case.
Yeah. It really is. And, unions are obviously some of the biggest givers, but also groups like, especially groups, I would say, like Chevron, AT&T, PG&E, some of these huge business interests, they're not partisan. What they want is to be able to make their case and what's best for their business. And so you really do see the spreading around money. Liberal Democrats, conservative Republicans, they're equal opportunity givers.
Right. So, John, not surprisingly, the number of lobbyists in the state capitol has grown over the last 10 years. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone.
Shocking.
Right. But what may be surprising to some is who is doing the lobbying. What did you find?
Well, I mean, everybody has a lobbyist these days, and I think that's reflective of the numbers you're talking about. Certainly the big corporations have lobbyists. But more and more, local government has a tremendous amount of lobbying presence in the Capitol. And I think if you step back and you're sitting in any community in California and you think, why does my local police chief need their own lobbyist to lobby our legislators in Sacramento? I mean, we dug through the numbers. I mean, and it is the single largest sector in terms of money spent on lobbying in California at this point. Cities, counties, special districts, again, police chiefs, district attorneys. Their answer is, we need access. We need to be able to bend their ear. We need to basically play defense. And I know you, Mark, and I have talked in the past about local governments feeling like Sacramento makes decisions that aren't good for them. We want to play defense if legislators do things. But again, these are taxpayer dollars being spent on contract lobbyists, professional lobbyists, to lobby other members of the government.
And it's important, I think, to know that this is in addition to all the money they give to the League of Cities, the California County
I was going to ask you about that. There are layers. It's not just the city. It's the League of Cities, it's the CSAC, Association of County Governments.
The Police Chiefs Association, the sheriffs,
and what's the goal here? I mean, why do they feel like they have to lobby so much? Is it just to block action? Is it to advocate for things, or to advocate, don't do this because it's going to hurt us?
Both. I think it's both, and I think that what's interesting is that you may have a city like San Francisco who does pay into CSAC or the League of Cities, but they don't agree on 100% of what their sister cities and counties believe in. So they take votes, and they may have a different point of view. So the mayor then sends his own lobbyists to Sacramento. I mean, it really is sort of all-encompassing.
So let me ask you this. Lobbying doesn't guarantee success. John, I want to ask you this. Yeah. Some cities, most cities, were very opposed to the elimination of redevelopment agencies. Right. Spent a lot of money lobbying to stop that from happening. It happened anyway. And I'm sure you've got other examples. So can an argument be made that some of these issues, it's better to get a legislator's attention and make sure they're fully informed that lobbying actually plays a role? It's a good thing.
Yeah, I don't think that there's anything evil inherently about lobbying, although it is interesting that, like, you talk to a lot of smart lobbyists and they say, you know, they go to a cocktail party, what do? I do advocacy. Because, I mean, lobbying becomes a dirty word. But lobbying is just simply trying to have your voice heard, and I don't think there's anything malicious or evil about that. I think the overarching goal of our project, this political muscle project we did, is that it's not terribly transparent who is using their influence. Influence sometimes works, influence sometimes doesn't work. I think a smart lobbyist knows that you win some, you lose some. Redevelopment was one where clearly the cards were stacked. The governor had a particular plan, the state needed the money. But also, if you look in the end of 2015 market, there were some bills that sort of brought back parts of redevelopment there that the governor was willing to do. I bet those would not have happened without lobbying from the local level.
I want to ask you, we only got 30 seconds left in this segment, but I want to ask you about lobby firms that spent money on lobbying and lost, and other firms that didn't spend money on lobbying and won. And the example I'd give is ETS, Educational Testing Service, a $240 million 3-year contract. What's around the whole issue of private companies lobbying the state for contracts?
So yeah, so under state law right now, if I go to the governor's office or to a lawmaker and I get paid to ask them for a change in law or regulation, it has to be disclosed. There's an open website where anybody can go and look. If you're lobbying for money through contracts, there's no disclosure requirements. And so I looked into this Common Core testing contract, as you mentioned, that's almost $250 million that was just awarded this spring, and found that a company that had a very long-standing relationship with the Department of Education won this contract.
ETS, right?
Yeah, ETS. It was up against some very big other.
But they weren't the lowest bidder.
They were not the lowest bidder, and it's unclear how much lobbying played a part because I worked for several months to try to uncover that, and because of this lack of disclosure law, we really couldn't find the answer. And so it may well be that every single company involved in this bidding process did have a lobbyist, but ETS won. And so the question is, did they have an upper hand because of their relationship or because of their lobbyist? We just don't know.
Again, transparency.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for that overview of political lobbying in state government. So how does a bill really become a law? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. I'm sure we all remember being entertained as kids watching that video, how a bill becomes a law. But what they never told us, however, is there are lots of different types of bills and lots of different ways a bill may or may not become a law. We're talking to John Myers and Marisa Lagos, who cover state government and politics for KQED. So, John, you've written about something called sponsored bills.
Right.
Can you explain what they are and their role in the legislative process?
Let's try. So
Okay.
we all know that legislators introduced hundreds and hundreds of bills every year. And no one at home believes that the legislator had every idea originally. I mean, we like to think these men and women are smart, but even a good legislator says, I listen to people, I take ideas, I want to make the state better. The question is whether the process of getting ideas is transparent. And I think it was one of the keys of us working on this project about influence, is that it is not transparent about where the ideas come from. So there are bills that are either inspired, and I'm being charitable, or written line for line, word for word by outside groups, by lobbyists, by interest groups, and then handed to some lawmakers and then have been introduced as that lawmaker's writing. Now, they are supposed to be called sponsored bills. It's a small little bit of transparency there. The problem is that it is very subjective, and it's on the honor system about which bill is marked sponsored or not.
Right.
And so we spent a lot of time working with sources, trying to figure out where bills came from, even approaching lawmakers and saying, I know this bit, I've got, some information, and some lawmakers don't want to admit that interest groups do write some of these bills.
And the sponsor bills are more successful typically than the generic bill.
They have a higher success rate, maybe in part because they've been thought about and they've had some buy-in from interest groups. But it is, again, not transparent to the public where these ideas are coming from. And I think a really good debate topic for the public is whether these are in the larger interests of Californians or whether they serve particular interests of particular groups.
Well, Marisa, let me follow up on that. So how do we know if a bill is actually sponsored? It's just voluntary by the legislator saying that?
Basically, yes. I mean, there was a time in the past before some previous media coverage where there was a little more disclosure, although there's no law requiring it. So on some bills, if you go to a committee analysis of legislation, you can see, oh, this has been proposed by so-and-so or
So read down after the end of the bill and
I mean,
there's the
and
analysis.
oftentimes there is, a group makes its opposition or support known publicly, that will be included on these bill analyses. But by and large, there's no requirement for disclosure. And as John mentioned, a lot of lawmakers and groups didn't want to admit that it happens.
Well, it's
at
really
all.
interesting. You know, I think you guys reported that when they first did this, I think the San Jose Mercury News did a story, and they found 39% of the bills in 2007-8 were sponsored.
Right.
Then I guess the legislators got the message, and now in the most recent legislative session, only 5% are supposedly being sponsored.
Which is just clearly not true. I mean, especially when you see, because there are bills that get reintroduced year after year, they're the same language. I mean, we know where they're coming from.
It's important to point out that when we did the story, all the bills weren't fully generated. So the 5% number probably will rise when you finally crunch out what happened in the legislative session. But yes, we are quite confident that the number of bills disclosed as being sponsored by outside groups have gone down because the outside groups and the lawmakers don't want to talk about it.
My notes show that in 13-14, you found only 15% were sponsored. So yes, more than half cut. So let me ask you this. There's something about bills getting hijacked, Marisa. What is that? When a sponsored bill gets hijacked, what happens?
Well, right. So if you're a lobbyist or outside group and you hand this bill over to a lawmaker, you have no control really once it gets going through the legislative process what's going to happen to it. And so there are times, and this is something that John, through some good reporting and sourcing, learned that essentially, maybe a lobbying group or an interest group introduced some language, and somewhere in the legislative process, it got changed to something that they want nothing to do with. And suddenly they're saying, that's not our bill anymore.
So they're fighting their own bill.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They try to kill the bill that they tried to help create before because it has been manipulated in some way. Again, nothing bad inherently about the legislative process. Transparent? Absolutely not.
Okay, let me ask you this, John. Legislators are limited to 40 bills in any two-year session, but there's no limit on how many bills can be submitted for drafting by the Office of the Legislative Counsel. That's kind of the ultimate seal of approval for legislation, and really the first step in the process to making a bill a law. Since they're limited to 40 bills per legislature, they get around this by something called an unbacked bill. What's an unbacked bill, and what's their role in the legislative process?
Unbacked bill is one of the great mysteries of Sacramento. And I will tell you, Marisa talked in an earlier segment about a lot of public records requests. I hit a brick wall with public records requests trying to find out how much work is done on bills that are drafted by the Legislative Council. They pretty much said, we don't have to tell you. An unbacked bill simply means a bill that does not have a legislator's name on it when it is drafted by the legislature's lawyers. What's interesting about that is that we have heard time and again, and everyone around the Capitol seems to know it, but again, it's not transparent, that interest groups will often go up to a lawmaker and say, hey, could you have the legislature's lawyers draft this for me? Oh yeah, sure, no problem. Legislature's lawyers draft the bill. It is handed back to the interest group, not introduced then, and sometimes put in a drawer, waiting for just the right moment to introduce this legislation that has been perfectly drafted, again, at taxpayer expense, not necessarily nefarious. It's good to have things drafted, but completely opaque. I mean, really the opaque part of the bill writing process.
So I guess a bill is not just a bill. It can take any manner of forms. Well, up next, the gruesome art of making laws. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Otto von Bismarck once famously stated that laws are like sausages. It's better not to see them being made. So how are laws being made? We're talking to John Myers and Marisa Lagos, who've worked on a year-long series exploring political influence in state government. So Marisa, let me ask you about legislative committee chairmen and the role they play in legislation. How are those chairmanships awarded?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's all up to legislative leadership, and both the Senate and the Assembly, the pro tem and the Assembly Speaker, have pretty much carte blanche to decide who's going to lead, some of the most powerful committees, and they really do, with influence obviously from the leaders, decide what legislation lives or dies and what it looks like when it comes out of there. What I found talking to former Speaker, to folks in and out of the building, is that a lot of it does have to do with sort of closeness to the speaker and political positioning and that sort of thing. But when you look at their campaign contributions, it really also has to do with how much money they raise and how much they give to the party.
Kind of bingo. That's a big deal. So they're out there, if they're in a safe district, why are they raising money? They're in a safe district. Well, they're raising money to give it to the party so they can get a chairmanship, which then a lot of money flows to them. It's just kind of a continuous cycle.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, John. You talked about a process where bills are removed from what's called a suspense file by the Appropriations Committee as a way to quietly kill a bill. Can you describe how that works?
I think I've already used the term opaque in this show. I'm going to use it again. Completely opaque. You have hundreds of bills that have to go through the legislature's two fiscal committees, the Appropriations Committees in the Assembly and the Senate. And ostensibly, ones are set aside to decide on later if they hit a threshold of cost to the state, if they cost money. And then, of course, everybody is supposed to say, well, how much money do we have? Which bills are we going to let go? That is part of the process. But the other part of the process is that decision of which bills come out of that mystery suspense file and move on is influenced by so many factors: money, politics, party position, interest groups. And all of that happens behind closed doors. And when they come out to the formal public hearing, they will simply say what is being held in committee. Nobody has to vote, no fingerprints. And it is a fascinating way at how political muscle is really used.
A place where bills go to die.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this, John, about gut and menace. This is another kind of a topic that is kind of interesting, a gruesome title.
Very gruesome.
Gut and amend.
Yeah.
How is it used and how does it work?
Simply put, Mark, it is a piece of legislation where someone takes the bill, because you said earlier in the program that you're limited to how many bills you can introduce, and there's a calendar for when you introduce them. If you've got an idea late in the game and you want to get it in there, you take a piece of legislation, you carve out all the contents of that bill, you put in brand new language, so a bill that was about school funding can turn into a bill about a tax break for oil companies.
Does it have the same title? They changed the title as well.
They have the bill number the same, but the title somewhat ultimately finally changes, and it's called a gut and amend, and it can happen all the time. They waive the rules if there are enough votes. The bottom line in Sacramento is if you have enough votes in both houses to waive the rules, you can do what you want to do.
Okay, so the Freedom for America Act could be anything.
Yes.
And a gut and amend. So, Marisa, there's also something called trailer bills that are inserted into the budget each year. Can you explain what they are and how that process works?
Yeah, so the legislature and the governor are held to basically having a budget in place by the end of June, and that's become even more important since Prop 25 passed a few years ago, which cuts off lawmakers' pay if they don't get it in to the governor by June 15th. So trailer bills are often used to sort of deal with outstanding issues from the budget process that haven't gotten wrapped up necessarily by that deadline. And I mean, they can really be used to fudge a lot of these deadlines, essentially. And so what we see is, the lawmakers go on break in July, they come back in August, and all of a sudden we're talking about huge issues around, policies in terms of the way the budget is rolled out, or even sometimes appropriations that are happening way outside of the budget process.
John, you talked about a recent example of a trailer bill, the solar tax break. Can you kind of explain that very briefly, what happened there?
Yeah, that was in 2014, and at the 11th hour, when we were about to have a budget, late at night in a committee hearing, all of a sudden we see a brand new bill we'd never seen anything before, which would extend this tax break for the solar industry. It wasn't a tax break that was about to expire, had not gone through a policy committee at all, but again, using the interest group influence that happens at the Capitol, it got put into the budget, and ultimately it passed, and it was put into law.
Well, it's interesting, that law was sunsetted, and the whole point of a sunset is to kind of check it out.
Review the policy,
and
it was never reviewed.
All right, that's kind of interesting. Well, we're going to learn. We just learned, I guess, how legislative sausage is made. Up next, how can we reform the process and make it more transparent? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis famously opined once that sunlight is the best disinfectant for political corruption. What's being done or what should be done to make state government more transparent? We're talking to John Myers and Marisa Lagos, who cover California government and politics at the state capitol. So Marisa, let me ask you, you've reported on attempts to propose legislation to curb the abuse of business lobby attempts to win state government contracts. What's being proposed?
Well, it's dead. No, it's not dead. No,
Okay, next.
So there's a bill that was up in the legislature this year, AB 1200,
Right.
that would bring procurements under the state lobbying laws. It did not make it out of the Senate. It will be brought up again next year. It's a 2-year bill now. But there was also other reform attempts this year, one that would have really required a lot more disclosure around behested payments by politicians. And as with a lot of these things, lawmakers aren't too keen on policing themselves more.
But it's interesting when you talk to a politician, they're all about being bipartisan in terms of transparency. They all seem to agree to it. What does the polling show?
Well, the polling shows that the public likes it. I mean, it's kind of like, mom and apple pie. I mean,
Right.
Who doesn't want more of that? I think the challenge is, to Marisa's point about those pieces of legislation, how do you change that process? The reality is that interest groups operate in the status quo. Interest groups like the status quo. If they didn't, then something would change. And so I think, there's an institutional reluctance to kind of get around some of this. Let me give you a great example if I can. So there has been all this discussion over previous years about a bill would have to be in print for 3 days
Right.
before it could be voted on. Everybody says that's a great idea. It had bipartisan support, Democrats and Republicans saying, yes, let's make the California Constitution say that. Except when we got to a water bond deal. Water bond deal was not in print for very long. The same lawmakers that authored the 3-day in print bill voted yes on the water bond that had been shoved through at the 11th hour. Now, they will argue that, political deal was made with this urgency, the state needs it. But again, when push comes to shove, the system wants flexibility, and that doesn't always mean transparency.
And I think lawmakers want the current system, the status quo. I mean, the interest groups certainly are part of it, but I don't think most lawmakers want to have to have more limits on the gifts they can take, have more limits on the disclosure that they have to make around what conversations they're having behind closed doors. And so what you really see is this sort of convergence of the existing power structure on both sides in and out of the Capitol. And then, what's most interesting to me is that on a lot of these bills, there's no stated opposition. Maybe in the last few days, you see some letters come out from some lobbying firms or law firms, really, but nobody comes out and says this is a bad idea, to your point about the public really supporting this.
Right, it's in the transparency. I'm just thinking, as a negotiator, you negotiate behind closed doors. If you try to negotiate in the sunshine, the transparency, what happens? People take positions and then nothing gets accomplished. So couldn't you make the argument that, well, maybe these things are better held behind closed doors because then people will let their hair down, they'll be honest about what their needs are, and they'll get some kind of solution?
You could, but I don't think anyone's asking for a transcript of these meetings. I think what we're talking about is really some understanding of who's involved in these conversations and who they're working for and why they're there. So, for example, back on the procurement issue, if you're lobbying for $1 billion state contract or more, we're talking, up to $35 billion on average in the last 10 years that gets handed out to private companies. I think we should know who in the power structure that exists in Sacramento is being paid to help secure this public money.
Well, let me ask you this. There's lots of reforms that are being proposed there. One is the 72-hour situation of proposing bills so people can read them in advance. What reforms do you think have the greatest chance of legislative success? Anything out there you think, well, this might actually happen?
Well, I think that legislative success and ballot success is not the same thing. I think that if we see any sort of
let's talk about legislation first.
Yeah. Well, we did see a few sort of minor tweaks this year to the legislative process or to the disclosure process. AB 1200 can come back again next year. That was the lobbying and procurement issue and be successful. A lot of times what you see is if things come out of the state's Fair Political Practices Commission and get sign on for maybe the governor or somebody else, it has a better chance.
We also saw a limited ban on fundraising during the peak of the season about bills and things like that. The state Senate put that into effect. Of course, it is part of the rules. It is not in law.
Right. And the Senate, not the Assembly.
Right, exactly. And so it has led to, but give them some credit there for trying to separate the influence game from the legislating
Well, it's just
game.
interesting, connecting the dots here, the Assembly is now where a lot of things seem to stop, and they're the place that they can still collect money from donors and...
you figured that out.
Yeah, there you go. Let me ask you really quick. We've only got 30 seconds, so real fast. Any propositions you're anticipating for the November ballot?
Yeah, so we just saw one filed about a week ago that's backed by some of, the sort of key political disclosure folks in the state, including Gary Winnick, a former FPPC lawyer, which kind of throws everything, including the kitchen sink here. It would deal with everything from dark money and outside PACs to behested payments and everything.
Yeah, a lot of disclosure, but you've got to see if you've got big money people to run it.
I guess we're going to find that out. I want to thank John Myers from KQED, the senior editor for California Politics and Government, and Marisa Lagos, who reports on state government and politics for KQED, for shining a light on political influence at the state capitol. I also want to recommend, by the way, their weekly podcast on California politics is both highly entertaining and informative, and I encourage you to listen to it. If you want to keep up with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute by going on Facebook or following us on Twitter or logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.